If your goal was to cripple the Russian military without getting dragged into a brutal, hand-to-hand bloodbath, where would you strike? The answer is not a tank column, not a trench line, and not even a frontline base. It is something far more fragile, far more valuable, and far more devastating to lose. Because in modern war, you do not always defeat the giant by breaking his fists. Sometimes, you defeat him by taking away his eyes. And what happened that night is enough to make military planners around the world sit upright in their chairs. 2:47 a.m., March 10, 2026. The skies over Bryansk are wrapped in dead silence. But far below, 1,700 night shift workers inside the Kremny L plant are still carefully inspecting electronic circuit boards in an isolated clean room. They have no idea that a death sentence disguised as a 866-pound stealthy block of metal is racing directly toward them. The world likes to celebrate Taiwan's 2-nanometer chips, while Kremny AL still produces ancient 500-nanometer chips that would look outdated even by 1995 standards. But here is the part that matters. Russia does not need bleeding-edge chips to run AI. It needs those crude 500-nanometer brains to guide its missiles. Destroying Kremny L means severing the optic nerve of the Russian war machine. If you want to bring down a giant boxer, you do not waste your strength trying to break his arms. You gouge out his eyes. And tonight, one of Russia's most expensive systems is about to walk straight into its worst nightmare. 2:40 a.m., exactly 155 miles from the target, 2 Ukrainian Su-24M fencers are slipping through the air defense perimeter, swallowing the freezing night at an altitude of just 150 feet. They maintain total radio silence, skimming through nap of the Earth flight mode at Mach 0.8. Do you think diving straight into the throat of the Russian air defense grid was some reckless spur-of-the-moment gamble by 2 random pilots? Not even close. Even Russian sources would later admit bitterly that this deep penetration route had been prepared long in advance. In reality, they are gliding through a lethal geometric corridor, carved precisely through the radio coverage gaps between defensive radar stations surrounding Bryansk. But where did they get spatial data that precise? Almost certainly from the imaging satellite networks of the United States and NATO. What you are witnessing here is a pure proxy war at the intelligence level, a carbon copy of the same pattern the United States used to back Israel in its shadow contest with Iran. Think of it like driving 120 miles per hour through a winding mountain pass in the dead of night, with your headlights turned off. It is suicidal. But once you have a GPS map accurate to the centimeter, drawn by your filthy rich neighbor, you are no longer a madman with a death wish. You are a ghost. As the Su-24M flight closes in on launch range, we need to talk about Russia's gatekeepers, the S-400 Triumph and Pantsir S-1 systems. On paper, the S-400 is an execution machine. Its 92 N6E radar can track 300 targets at once at a range of 250 miles. Nestled inside that umbrella sits the inner protective layer, the Pantsir S-1, boasting a 12-mile defense radius and a reaction time of just 4 seconds. This is Russia's most expensive defensive toy, the one Moscow proudly marketed to Turkey and anyone else willing to nod, smile and pay. But arrogance has a habit of creating weak spots. Precisely because they trusted the S-400 too much, the Russians deployed far too few low-altitude radars in the inner ring. Taiwan's military leadership is watching this night with held breath, because if Western weapons can bypass the S-400, then the same lesson can absolutely be applied against China's HQ-9 system across the strait. Now stop for a second and put yourself in the boots of a commander. If you know the enemy has a low-altitude blind spot, do you just charge straight through it and hope for the best? Of course not. This is not a video game. The battlefield does not come with a respawn button. Bryansk sits deep inside Russian territory. No matter how low you fly, if the S-400 focuses the full processing power of its phased array radar toward the west, where your missiles are approaching from, the interception rate is still brutally high. 2:46 a.m. Deep inside a vast snow-covered forest, 9 miles north of the Kremny L plant, a Ukrainian SSO Special Forces unit is holding its breath. The temperature is -15 degrees Celsius, but sweat still beads on the forehead of the comms soldier as he flicks off the safety. They are lying in the throat of the Russian bear itself. Then 6 heavy FPV drones from the Mammoth series, each carrying armor-piercing shaped charge warheads, rip into the wind and launch upward from the treetops. They do not climb high. Instead, they skim tight over the pine canopy, racing directly toward the 96L6E early warning radar station. And remember, the 96L6E is the crucial low-altitude eye of the S-400. The Russian crew immediately detects 6 signals charging in at nearly 100 miles per hour. The alarm screen lights up. The first instinct of the Russian air defense crew is not to shoot. It is to instantly activate their powerful electronic warfare systems to fry the drone's circuitry and sever their control links. A dense wall of radio interference floods the area. But 9 miles away, inside the VR goggles of the Ukrainian pilots, the 4K video feed remains perfectly clear, sharp enough to see every snowflake without a hint of static. Why? Because these mammoths are not using radio waves at all. Spooling from the tail of each FPV is a razor-thin 10-kilometer fiber optic cable running straight from the drone's motherboard to the operator's controller. See what they just did? Trying to jam a physical cable with electromagnetic waves is like trying to hack a typewriter with a USB stick. It is completely useless. The Russians are helpless in the electronic realm. Forced out of the EW fight, the Pantsir S-1, acting as the bodyguard, has no choice but to bare its teeth with kinetic fire. The massive turret snaps 120 degrees north. The fire control radar locks on. 230mm2 A38M automatic cannons erupt, throwing a glowing red wall of steel into the sky at a rate of 5,000 rounds per minute. The lead FPV explodes into a fireball 800 meters from the target. The second and third try to weave through the storm of bullets, but their carbon shells are torn apart and flutter down into the snow. The Pantsir's computer performs exactly as designed. It then launches a 57E6 missile and shreds the fourth drone. The fatal weakness of fiber optic drones is that they cannot pull extreme maneuvers without snapping the cable, and the Russians are exploiting that weakness as hard as they can. But the last two FPVs are not being guided by artificial intelligence. They are being flown by human reflexes through a zero-latency video feed. In the tiny split second that the Pantsir's targeting system must recalculate, its 30mm cannons need exactly 1.5 seconds to traverse and acquire the next target, and that 1.5 seconds is fatal. The final two FPVs slip straight through the kinematic blind spot. FPV number 5 suddenly pitches into a 60-degree dive and slams directly into the face of the Pantsir's tracking radar dish. The explosive charge detonates, ripping away the eyes of the close-range interceptor. The 30-ton self-propelled vehicle shudders violently, instantly blinded. And then, exactly 2 seconds later, the last FPV glides through the black smoke and drives its PG-7 VL armor-piercing warhead directly into the fully loaded missile launch tubes on the roof. Boom! A chain reaction lights up an entire corner of the forest. Russia's expensive bodyguard machine turns into a giant torch. The Russians thought they were stopping a raid. In reality, they had just been stripped of their inner armor. By forcing the Pantsir to swing its guns north, and then using that same unjammable fiber optic link to execute it, a giant radio gap to the west was officially blown wide open. There were no longer any low-altitude defensive systems protecting the S-400's flank. Ukraine already has a very clear pattern of using drone swarms as bait before delivering the real missile strike. Picture it like this. You are breaking into a house guarded by a watchdog, so you smash a bottle in the left corner of the yard, and when the dog bolts over there barking its head off, you calmly walk in through the front door on the right. It sounds simple, but it is so audacious that the Russians never believed anyone would dare try it this deep inside their own territory. Israel used this same classic method during Operation Orchard in 2007, launching drone decoys to pull Syrian air defense attention in one direction and clear the path for F-15s to sweep in and obliterate a nuclear reactor. But tonight, Ukraine did not just study the Israeli Air Force playbook, it upgraded it. Their decoys had teeth, and those teeth just chewed the hunter to pieces. 2:48 a.m., far out in the quiet darkness, the real killing blow begins. Two stealthy blocks of metal, storm shadows weighing 2,860 pounds each, drop simultaneously from the bellies of the two Su-24Ms. Their turbojet engines ignite with a roar, tearing into the night. But they do not fly together. The pair immediately split apart by 8 miles, forming two sharply angled approach vectors. Why does that matter? Because it forces the S-400 to divide the radiating energy of its phased array radar and scan both directions at once. And the S-400 immediately proves why it is still one of the most terrifying monsters in the sky. In spite of the missile's stealth shaping, the 92N6E radar punches through the chaos and locks onto Storm Shadow number 1 at a range of 18 miles. The automated intercept sequence triggers. A giant 48N6 missile, the size of a steel telephone pole, blasts upward in a blinding white column of fire, accelerating to hypersonic speed. Boom! A brilliant fireball flashes across the sky. On the command screen inside the radar station, the words "Kill Confirmed" begin blinking. The duty crew exhales in relief, but their shirts are already soaked in cold sweat. And think about the absurdity of the math. Russia just spent $3 million to destroy a $2 million missile. On cost alone, Ukraine already won. But the real price Russia is paying is infinitely higher than that missile exchange. Storm Shadow number 1 was born for one purpose only: to die. Its flight path was never aimed at the factory. It was programmed to act as an electronic magnet, forcing that giant air defense system to pour its processing power into one direction and leave the western angle dangerously exposed. Missile number 1 just purchased Ukraine exactly 47 seconds of Russian blindness. Would you dare sacrifice $2 million as a pawn? Ukraine did, and during those 47 seconds, Storm Shadow number 2 is flying low and smooth, hidden just under the radio horizon. By the time the S-400 finishes processing the first kill and swings its radar back west, missile number 2 has already slipped into the blind zone at a range of less than 15 miles. The S-400's computer screams alarms, but math does not care about panic. For the air defense system to recalculate, reacquire, launch and destroy the new target, it needs 52 seconds. But Storm Shadow number 2, racing through the air at Mach 0.8, is only 31 seconds from impact. There is no miracle in physics that can erase a 21-second deficit. On the other side of the world, Taiwanese generals are almost certainly going to study this Bryansk scenario frame by frame. This is exactly the nightmare they have feared: an air defense network distracted by a decoy, saturated by a sacrificial pawn, while the finishing strike slides in from the perfect blind angle. In the nose of missile number 2, the protective cover snaps open. The imaging infrared seeker powers up and begins scanning. It finds the silhouette of building number 3 at the Kremny EL plant and locks on hard. Countdown, 45 seconds. Below those death coordinates, more than 200 elite Russian engineers are still carefully handling individual microchips inside an ISO Class 4 cleanroom. And remember what that means. The air in there is filtered cleaner than a heart surgery operating room. The standard is effectively 0 particles above 0.1 microns per cubic meter. If even a single grain of dust gets into the process, an entire batch of missile guidance chips can be ruined, and now 1,000 pounds of steel and explosives is racing toward the roof. Inside the radar control tower, the officer who just celebrated the first interception suddenly feels a chill run through his spine. A demonic red dot is flashing dead center on the screen. He grabs the radio and screams into it, calling his superiors until his voice nearly tears apart. But the commander on the other end is busy reporting the successful kill of the first missile to the general staff. A cold, useless dial tone drags on. 18 hopeless seconds vanish just trying to get a connection. Storm Shadow, 27 seconds remaining. The countdown has now transformed into a death sentence with no appeal. At the 20-second mark, the panicked Panzer crew in the inner ring yanks the lever, desperately trying to swing the turret back from the north. At 15 seconds, the firing angle has already exceeded the kinematic limit. The targeting system is helpless. 10 seconds to impact. The missile's camera begins its vertical dive, clearly identifying every gap in the factory roof's ventilation shafts. 5 seconds remaining. Kremny L's air raid sirens finally start screaming into the night, but they begin exactly 5 seconds too late. At that point, the line between warning and death has already been crossed. That is no longer a siren, it is a funeral song. 2:51 a.m. Bryansk gets a brand new star in the sky. Only this star is burning at 0 feet altitude and making more noise than a heavy metal concert inside a bathroom. The Broach warhead behaves like a professional thief with a sense of style. First, the precursor charge punches through 10 feet of reinforced concrete. Then a 0.3 second delay fuse waits just long enough for the weapon to bury itself deep inside. After that, 990 pounds of explosives truly begin the celebration. Why not just explode on the outside? Because an outdoor blast throws overpressure outward in every direction, like farting in a stadium. It is unpleasant, but it does not kill everyone. But detonate inside a confined space, and all 6,800 pounds per square inch of pressure has nowhere to escape. It slams into everything around it with 10 times the violence. And the equipment inside that clean room is so sensitive that even a heavy footstep can ruin an entire chip batch. Now imagine what 6,800 pounds per square inch does when it kicks the door in. Cyber-Boroshno satellite imagery later confirmed 5 direct hits. 15,000 square feet of the main production building were engulfed in flames. For most factories, this would be a terrible setback, but still only a setback. Replace the machinery, rebuild the walls, restart the line, business as usual, but not for Kremny L. The destroyed equipment was German-made, purchased before sanctions. Russia can no longer buy it, cannot easily source it elsewhere, and has never truly learned how to manufacture it domestically. Their so-called autonomous defense industry in semiconductors is like somebody claiming they know how to cook, while not knowing which knob turns on the stove. The Institute for the Study of War assessed it bluntly. Operations halted for years, with no real roadmap for recovery. Russia is now trapped from both directions, and the convoy is already racing toward it. And while the Kremlin struggles to contain that public relations disaster, the domino effect has already started. Think of this causal chain like something from high school physics. Fewer guidance chips means fewer interceptor missiles can be built. Fewer interceptor missiles means the air defense network becomes thinner and weaker. A thinner air defense grid makes it easier for Ukraine to strike again. More successful strikes mean even fewer chips. And that cycle does not have a stop button. This is not a linear loss. It is exponential, like compound interest running in reverse. According to Russian insider sources, the governor of Bryansk region urged the Kremlin to stop bombing Ukraine until the province could be better protected. Think about what that means. A Russian politician was effectively demanding that Moscow de-escalate because his own territory was now bleeding. And when voices like that begin rising from inside the system itself, then the so-called special military operation has developed problems far deeper than the battlefield. And in other corners of the geopolitical map, observers are taking very careful notes. Tehran knows its missile program also depends on chips smuggled in through Chinese channels. The same category of chips, the same dependency, the same fatal weakness. That night, they watched their Russian ally lose a second chip factory in less than a year. Israel, with its long tradition of terrifyingly precise intelligence work, almost certainly filed that lesson into exactly the right folder. And in Taipei, generals are looking over the Taiwan Strait and silently thanking God they are not the ones depending on the HQ-9 after a night like this. Then dawn rose over Bryansk, spilling a pale straw-yellow light across the smoking ruins. Fire crews moved through the rubble. War correspondents scrambled to find the best camera angles. And somewhere inside the Kremlin, somebody had to explain to Putin how a multi-billion-dollar air defense complex failed against 2 missiles and 6 drones, whose total price tag did not even equal a brand new Ferrari. And of course, the real answer does not come down to a lack of hardware. It comes down to mindset. This is the kind of lesson that will be taught in military academies for decades. You do not need to destroy the Russian army. You only need to lobotomize it so it cannot function. And on the night of March 10, 2026, Ukraine tore out a major piece of that brain in a way the previous 6 drone strikes never could. So if you were a Ukrainian commander staring at the Bryansk satellite imagery this morning, what target goes next on your desk? Micron in Zelenograd, Russia's largest remaining chip plant, or the Iranian drone factory pumping Shaheds into this war machine like a tireless mechanical heart? Drop your answer in the comments right now. Which one would you choose? And what weapon would you send to knock on their door? This is Strategic War Files.